Hello guys, welcome back to our Mpesa series journey. In this final episode, we are going to have a look at how we should be able to persist our C2B and B2C requests and responses to our Mongo database. So let us get started. So number one thing that you need to do is make sure that your MongoDB is up and running. Once you've done that, then we should be able to go. We should be able to proceed to the next steps. So number one thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to add our repository for C2B, B2C. So B2C, C2B, entries repository. Then I'm going to do a constructor injection. Right? Good. So far so good. So the next thing that we need to do is now number one, let us now save our simulate C2B request to the database. All right. So we expect a B2C C2B entry. So let us import this B2C C2B entry is equals to new. All right. So I'm going to put this into a new variable. Okay, so we expect it to be of this type. Okay, so let us proceed and do. So one thing that we did not do is that when you have a look at our request, we are sending also a bill reference number. So we also need to save this to our B2C C2B entry. All right. So I'm going to come and do this private string the bill reference number. The other thing that we need to change is the raw callback payload response, which is basically the response that we are going to be getting is going to be an object type. So I'm going to change that to an object. So let us proceed with our implementation. So when we simulate, so we can set the transaction type. This is a C2B. We should be able to set the bill reference number. All right, we should be able to set the amount. All right, get the amount. So let me also change our amount for now to a string. All right, but of course you can also still work with it as long as you just convert this string into a long. All right, you can also set the transaction date, or basically the entry date. Okay, what else can we set? Let's have a look. The bill we've set, amount, the conversation and originator conversation. All right, that's an important one. So set originator conversation ID, we're going to get it from this response. Originator conversation ID. We also need to set the conversation ID. All right, so get the conversation ID. I think with that we're pretty much done with the values that we can set. The phone number also, we also need to set the phone number. So set MSISDN, which is going to come from the request. All right, so what else can we fill in? So all right, we've set this. I think we are good to go. Now when we do a request, we also need to save. So I'm going to come get our repository, and then I'm going to say save. In our case, I'm going to save this entry over here. All right, good. Now on our validation endpoint, we need to get the current entry based on the bill reference number, in this case for our C2B. All right, so I'm just going to come and say then find by a bill reference number. We did not add that, so let us go to our repository. We add this entry over here. So find by bill reference number. All right, so string a bill reference number. All right, cool. So I can come now and say find by bill reference number. So the response, get the bill reference number. Okay, so I'm just going to add this into a variable. Just going to name it B2C entry. All right, of course here you could check for nulls, right, but for now I'm just going to assume the happy path. So once we have that, then let us proceed and update. So if we have received the callback, that means the transaction was successful, so we can set the result code. Okay, we can also set the raw callback response to the whole of this data. All right, so we can also set the transaction ID, which should be this one, get transaction ID. All right, so what else can we fill in? So we've set this, we've set this, we've set conversation, the amount, the bill reference number, transaction, and the internal ID. And with that, I think now we are good. And as usual, let us now save after we have done our manipulation or editing. Okay, good. So let us run our application again. Okay, here we have cleared. Let it run. Okay, running on port 8080. So I'm going to simulate. It was accepted successfully. If you have a look at our database, you will see that our request has been persisted. So this is a request, okay, with the data that we did send. So far it is working as expected. Let's see if we've received our callback. Yes, we have. So what do we expect? We expect that all the new details of the request are going to be updated into our database. So let's have a look. Let me refresh, and there you go. So as you can see, the transaction ID has been persisted, and also the raw payload has also been persisted. All right, cool. And I think now that for C2B we're pretty much done. Okay, everything is working as expected. So let's proceed and now do the same thing for our B2C transaction. All right, so going to proceed. So what we can do here is first of all, before we even, this is going to be the callback for the B2C. So first of all, where we are simulating the B2C request. All right, here we are. So as usual, I'm going to introduce to put this into a new variable. Okay, so common synchronous response. Okay, then I'm going to do this, that, right? So for the common synchronous response, we also have the originator conversation ID, and we have the conversation ID. All right. So, and you have if you have a look at our simulate B2C transaction, this is the kind of a payload that we are sending. All right. So let's go ahead and set. So number one thing, let me first of all check our repository. So it is, so we need to create, basically to save an object again of type B2C C2B entry. Right, so I'm going to come and get it. So this is what I'm going to save. Goes to new entry to the right. So the details are going to be more or less the same for simulate C2B, so just with a few changes. So I'm going to come here, so change this one. So this is going to be a B2C. Oh, okay. B2C. All right. So the bill reference number, in our case we do not have the bill reference number, so we can omit this. Okay. We need the amount, which is 100. Right. Internal request, get the amount, is going to be the entry date, the originator conversation ID. We're going to get it from our common synchronous response. All right. So it's going to be get originator conversation ID and conversation ID. So the MSISDN is going to be the internal request, get party A. All right, get party B rather, because as you saw, our party B is going to be the phone number. All right. So conversation ID, which is originator, get originator conversation ID. So with that we also come and we save. Right. So once that is done, I think we've pretty much done all the essentials that are required for us to save. All right. So we should be good to go. Enter date, result code. All right. So now during a B2C request, we are able to perform all these actions, and we are able to persist the request to our database. All right. So in our callback, we are going to fetch the result based on the originator or conversation ID. All right. So this is going to be our callback endpoint. All right. So I'm going to come here and say find by conversation or by conversation ID or the originator conversation ID. So I'm going to come here, get this, get the result. So the first one is conversation ID. Again, that, get the result, then get the originator conversation ID. Make sense? So let me put it on a new line, actually, so that it is a bit more clearer. I'm going to come and just undo this. Okay, then I introduce a local variable, replace the three occurrences. So this is going to be the B2C result. So this result is what we're getting. So I'm just coming and replacing get the B2C result, get the conversation ID, B2C result, then get the conversation ID. then I need to put this into another local variable. All right, so let's say B2C, B2C, B2C will be internal record, something like that. All right, now that we have the representation, we can now update the details as needed. All right, so set number one, the raw payload response is going to be this. Okay, we also need to set the result code, set the result code, which is basically going to be the B2C result, then get the result code. We also need to set the transaction ID. All right, set the transaction ID, which basically again is going to be the result dot get the transaction ID. All right, so while this is on screen, let's have a look. Int, so B2C, so the result code, you can just come here and say string dot the value of, basically just converting that integer into a string. So we've set the raw callback, the result code, the transaction ID. What else do we need to set? And I think with that we're pretty much done. So let us again run our request and see if everything is going to be persisted as expected. Right? Oh, one thing we've just forgotten before we run, in our repository, now we also now come and update the changes that we've just done. All right, let us now run and see. Okay, let us wait for it to start running. Good. Let us now simulate our B2C. So okay, success. Let's have a look at our DB. All right, as you can see, this was the initial one for C2B, but this is the one we have an interest with. The transaction type is B2C. All right, this is a transaction ID, this is a phone number, the amount, the conversation ID, the originator conversation ID. So as you can see, we already received the callback response. So by the time we are coming to have a look at this record on the database, the callback had already come and the result is being persisted, as you can see. All right, reference data. So we already have everything that Safaricom is sending to us, and we are able to persist into our Mongo database. Pretty neat, right? So we have everything working as expected. Now a few pointers that I would like to maybe say is that number one, as you can see, we currently have our logic in our controller. Remember, in a controller, ideally you should aim to have a very thin layer within the controller. So all this logic can be pushed to a different service, or basically you could create another service that does all this, such that this controller can be as thin as possible. Now, when sending a request, or basically when acknowledging to Mpesa that you've received this response, ideally you find that this is a possible scenario where it may take a minute or two for this operation to be completed. So there are various alternatives in which you can do to improve performance. By this I mean, once you've received a callback, you just need to tell Safaricom, okay, you've received your callback and thank you, and that's just it. So how can we improvise or basically improve this performance? So there you can use something like queues, all right, queues, where you can use things like RabbitMQ, all right, RabbitMQ. You can use Apache Kafka, all right. You can also use things like ActiveMQ, all right, such that when you receive this data, just send this payload into a queue, and then internally let other services handle the implementation like we have done here. All right. So guys, I hope this series has been helpful to you. So I will see you in other episodes where we will continue learning other things. As for this one, have a good one. I'll see you in the next series. Goodbye.